Hello everyone, I'm Rebecca Keppel. Today's video is another episode of my favorite series, New and Must-Have Crafty Supplies. The reason I love these videos is because I really enjoy trying out new supplies, sharing the ones that I really love with you all, and you can see them up close in person to decide if they're right for you. It's been a minute since I've done one of these videos, so I have a whole bunch of new things to share, including Simon Hurley's Lunar Paste, the new stamp cleaning cloth from Tonic Studios, the new acetate boxes from Tonic Studios, which make it really easy to give your handmade cards as a gift, some really fun geometric stencils from Pretty Pink Posh, and I wanted to try out the Heffy Doodle white cardstock that is supposed to be Copic friendly. So let's take a quick look at these supplies. This is the Nuvo stamp cleaning cloth. The package says it can be used with water alone or with a stamp cleaning solution, and that it can clean both your stamps and your work surfaces. It also says it can be washed in the washer machine. I've used many cleaning cloths and I must be very hard on them because I always end up with holes in them. This one says the weave is very strong, so I'm hoping it will last a while. These are the Tonic Studios acetate boxes. These boxes come flat packed and once folded are 6.5 by 5 by 1 inches, so perfect for A2 cards. They also sell 6.5 by 6.5 boxes for square cards. There are 5 boxes in the package. Next up is the Heffy Doodle white letter size cardstock, which is described as being Copic friendly. It's definitely a lighter weight than 110-pound cardstock, but you'll see in the video that it is ultra smooth and does indeed work very well with Copic markers. Next are the stencils from Pretty Pink Posh. I love these geometric stencils for creating my own unique patterns. Next up is the Simon Hurley Lunar Paste. I purchased the red, which is called Bee Sting, yellow, which is Slippery When Wet, and blue, which is called Clear Skies. The color and shine from these are incredible. Lastly, we have the Lawn Fawn Perfectly Plaid Remix 6x6 paper pad. I was really hoping they would re-release this pad because it was my absolute favorite when it came out. I hoarded it as long as I could, but eventually used it all up. I love the color combos and the different plaid designs in this pad. Now, let's use these new supplies to create some cards. For this first card, I'm using the Pretty Pink Posh Circles stencil and masking off the second row of circles with some Thermoweb purple tape. And I'm going to cover the first row with the Clear Skies Lunar Paste. I'm using a small Tonic Studios spatula to scoop a bit of the lunar paste out and apply it over the stencil. The texture is kind of like a thick mousse, not foamy per se, but definitely whipped. So you need a good amount to cover the paper. Since I didn't buy the orange or the green, I thought I would create a mix of the yellow and blue for the second row, and then yellow and red for the third. I didn't try mixing the colors off to the side yet. I'm planning on making a video with multiple ways to use this paste, so stay tuned for that. Instead, I just created a marbled effect. You definitely achieve a little bit of dimension by using these, but even more special is the vibrant color and shine you can create with them. In a follow-up video, I'll be sure to share that they even shine and look great on black cardstock, but I really love the pop of color here on the white as well. I don't want to add too much to this card, so I can let those shiny circles steal the show. I'm just stamping the You Are the Best from the Stamp Market's You're the Best Dad stamp set in Stamp Market black ink. I'm using the StampersSecret Debbie tool on this large stamp to get good pressure, and then I clean off the stamp with that Nuvo cleaning cloth, and it works really, really well. I cut the sentiment out with the coordinating dies after holding them in place with purple tape. I cut the circle's background down a bit so I could mat it on an A2 piece of black cardstock. Then popped up the sentiment with some Thermoweb foam squares. I really love the lunar pastes and I can't wait to see what else they can do. For this lunar paste card, I'm going to use Thermoweb Stencil Pal and Pixie Spray to cover an entire stencil with one color of the paste. So I spray the back of the stencil with the Pixie Spray. While it's drying on the stencil, I place a piece of cardstock down on the overspray. I'm using a glass mat today as my work surface. When the spray on the stencil is dry, I place it on top of some blue cardstock that I've cut down to 4 by 5 1/4. Add pressure to make sure every bit of the stencil is temporarily adhered down. Then use the Tonic Studio spatula to scoop some of the lunar paste out and place it on the straight edge of the Thermoweb Stencil Pal. This medium needs a decent amount to get good coverage. Since this stencil opens side to side, I'm going to move the stencil pal at a slight angle in that horizontal direction. I definitely needed to add a bit more paste to cover the stencil fully. I love how when you peel back the stencil, the thin lines of the stencil show up in the light blue cardstock and everything else is shiny and bright. I used a thin metal palette knife to pick up the panel and set it aside to dry. While that was drying, I stamped some sea creatures from Heffy Doodle's Oceans of Love stamp set on their Copic-friendly cardstock with Copic-friendly ink, which I used Gina K's Amalgam in Obsidian. I cleaned the stamps with the Nuvo cloth. This was my first attempt at Copic coloring on this paper, and I have to say that I absolutely loved it. The paper is super smooth, and I didn't notice a lot of bleeding outside the lines, but I did find it pretty easy to blend the colors. I am not an expert colorist, and I didn't use a ton of fancy blending and shading here, but for anyone struggling to get a smooth blend on other paper and getting frustrated, this might be a good option for you. So far, I'd say I'm definitely a fan. I stamped and heat embossed in white a sentiment from the stamp set. I'm still waiting for the lunar paste to dry, but I'm getting impatient. So I added tape runner to the middle of the pattern paper A2 panel that I cut from the Lawn Fawn Perfectly Plaid pad and adhered the panel on top. I put a thin row of tape runner on the back of the vellum sentiment and adhered that down towards the bottom of the panel where I had actually smeared it a bit, testing it to see if it was dry. Then I had fun creating the scene by popping up all the little sea creatures on Thermoweb foam squares. The lunar paste makes it really easy to create a shiny and fabulous background. For this card, I'm going to try out the Heffy Doodle white cardstock for ink blending. It's not as thick as the Nina Solar White I usually use, but it's definitely smoother. I'm going to use a combination of the two Pretty Pink Posh stencils, starting with the circles. Once again, I did use the Pixie Spray to hold the stencil in place, only this time I'm using domed foam blenders with some Tim Holtz Distress Oxide ink in Kitsch Flamingo. Honestly, the smoothness of the cardstock was truly a joy to ink blend on. I was able to quickly and easily get a smooth, even blend. The cool thing about these geometric stencils is having the ability to combine them to make some fun patterns. So I removed the circles and placed the squares with the lines from the squares running through the center of the inked circles. I used squeeze lemonade for the squares. I did have to move the stencil once to complete the pattern, but it was easy to do since I had already had squares to line the stencil up with. Then I used Wild Honey to ink blend the open squares since I had skipped every other row the last time. I liked this pattern, but I wanted to add a bit more to it, so I brought back the circle stencil and the Kitsch Flamingo to add a few more layers of circles, just slightly overlapping the circles I had already blended in the center of the card. I trimmed my stencil panel down and matted it on some coral reef cardstock from the stamp market. Then I used anti-static powder and stamped my Trinity Stamps big and bold sentiment that says "Miss You" with the stamp market emboss ink. I poured gold embossing powder on top and heat set it. Super quick and easy card that could be made so many different ways with different colors and different layering of the squares and circles, and of course different sentiments. For this next card, I'm going to use a whole rainbow of Copic markers to create a hand-drawn rainbow background on the Heffy Doodle cardstock. I'm actually using the chisel tip side of the marker to draw a few lines of each color, making sure I overlap between colors so we can see some blending. This is a really easy way to create a rainbow background and get to know some of your Copic markers and how they work together. And here it was a really good way to see just how smooth this white cardstock is. The lines don't have to be perfectly straight or even. The little wobbles add a touch of whimsy and movement that you wouldn't get by using a ruler. I flipped the panel over just to share how little the Copic markers have bled through. For how much lighter it feels than, say, 110-pound cardstock, there was very little bleed through. I matted it on an A2 piece of white cardstock, and yes, once again, I got some ink where I didn't want it, but I decided to forge ahead because there were several things I was going to add on top, and I figured I could hide the mistakes. I'm going to use the Waffle Flower oversized rainbow stamp set and die to create my sentiment. So I stamped the sub-sentiment, "You Are My," with the Stamp Market black ink. I die cut the shadow layer for the rainbow word die from Simon Says Stamp vellum and used some tape runner to adhere it on one of the ink spots. Then I grabbed my Thermoweb Ultra Bond pen and adhered the rainbow die cut from white cardstock on top of the shadow layer. I took care of the last little ink mistakes with confetti sequins from Pretty Pink Posh, and I am so glad I was able to save this rainbow panel. For this card, I'm using the Heffy Doodle Home Sweet Home stamp set, stamped on their white cardstock with Copic friendly ink. I like to stamp all the images I'm going to use at once in Copic friendly ink, so I use my Debbie tool to get good pressure on all the individual stamps. Then again, clean those stamps with the Nuvo cleaning cloth before I place them back on their sheet. I did use the cloth to clean up my work surface too, and you can see it got bits of paint and lunar paste off very easily. This is the salt cellar that I use to keep both the cloth slightly damp without getting musty, and mostly to keep the wet cloth off my desk, because if I don't, I'll end up accidentally creating a big wet spot on cardstock or whatever I'm working on. So again, I did some basic Copic coloring. Some parts of these images are pretty small, but I was able to do some shading. The car is darker on the bottom. The roof on the right is the brightest at the top of the house. The only spot that ended up not super smooth was the awning on the blue house, and the reason that happened is because that particular marker turns out is running out of ink. Whenever you have trouble getting super smooth looks from Copics, 9 times out of 10 that means your marker's getting dry. I really liked how easy it was to color on this paper, and I think it is especially a good option for beginners like myself who struggle with getting smooth blends. So I wanted to compare it to the other papers that I have. On the left is the Heffy Doodle, and I've colored all of the images. To compare, I stamped the same ink on the tree and car on the hammer mill in the center and the Nina 110-pound on the right. The hammer mill is pretty smooth. The one issue I have with hammer mill is that I noticed more bleeding. You can see a few spots on the car windows from the orange bleeding into the window. The Nina also has some bleeding, but the main issue with the Nina, it's not as smooth as either the hammer mill or the Heffy Doodle. So if you're using Nina Solar White and struggle with Copics, this might be the reason why. I still love my Nina for card bases, for stamping, and die cutting, but I just don't think it's great for Copic coloring, especially if you struggle with getting a nice, smooth blend. In camera, the Heffy Doodle looks bright white, while the others have an off-white tint. In person, for me, in my lighting, the Heffy Doodle had a slight gray cast, but I still prefer it for Copic marker coloring considering the ease of blending and the lack of bleeding. To complete this card, I took another piece of the Heffy Doodle paper and cut it down to an A2 size, and I'm using the Heffy Doodle Loads of Roads stencil to ink blend a road on my card panel. The smoothness of this paper also makes it a great candidate for ink blending. After I blended the base of the road with Distress Oxide Black Soot, I added some mowed lawn above and below it for a grassy hill, and then added some sky with salvaged patina. You can see how quickly and easily eventually I was able to complete these simple blends. Between the domed foam, the Distress Oxide, and the Heffy Doodle paper, I think I finally found my favorite ink blending supply compilation. I placed the lines of the road over my ink blending and added some Thermoweb Blanco gel, which dries white, opaque, and shiny. Once you dry it, you could add foil to this gel with a laminator, but I'm just going to leave this one white. I stamped the sentiment in the sky. Not only did I smear it, but it was crooked too. I had been in a rush and I didn't want to wait for the gel to dry, so I couldn't put it in my MISTI, but there's no way I'm starting over, so we'll fix that in a bit. I used Thermoweb foam squares to pop up the car, houses, tree, and cloud, and then stamped and trimmed the sentiment down on a sentiment strip, and to make it consistent, I popped that up as well. I ended up liking this better because I had the same dimension as everything else, and it had the pop of white that is around the die cuts and on the road too. So visually, I thought it made more sense, and it fixed the mistake. Now that I have all these handmade cards, I found Gina K envelopes to match and folded up the Tonic Studios box and placed the cards inside. The box is super strong and when closed will stay closed and keep your cards protected. I love that it's clear and you can see the rainbow and bright colors inside. I used a bit of Thermoweb Gina K white ribbon with silver to tie a bow around the outside. This would make such a great gift for someone who loves to send cards but is not a card maker themselves. I hope you enjoyed seeing these new supplies. Let me know in the comments below which one is your favorite this month. If you want to check out my last new and must-have crafty supplies video, I'm going to link to that over here. As always, I want to thank you so much for spending time with me today. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you again soon. Oh, nope. Car coming through. They're not mine exactly. I mean, these are mine. Hello. Hello, everyone. Who am I again? No one knows.